She thought the ring meant forever. Instead, Ethan Cross held it up in the middle of Caldwell's main street, in front of the general store, the sheriff's office, the whole damn town, and dropped it into the dirt like it was garbage. "I can't marry something that looks like that," he said, and the people laughed. Clara Whitmore stood there in her best dress, the one she'd mended 3 times at the hem, and felt every single person in that crowd choose him over her in the space of a single breath. If you want to know how a woman survives a moment like that, how she walks out the other side and becomes something no one in that town ever expected, then stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started with a kind of nervous brightness that Clara Whitmore couldn't quite settle into. She'd been up before the rooster, before the gray light even bothered pulling itself over the eastern ridge. She'd heated water on the small iron stove in the back room of Nell Patterson's boarding house, the room she'd rented for the past 2 years with the wages she made taking in laundry and mending. And she'd washed her hair and pinned it up the way she'd seen the Hartley sisters do it, soft at the temples and tight at the back. She'd put on her dress, the blue one, the one with the small white buttons down the front that she'd bought secondhand from Mrs. Alderman's shop, but had taken in at the waist herself so it actually fit the shape she had, rather than the shape someone else used to have. She'd looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin for a long time. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Permission, maybe. Some small confirmation that she was allowed to feel what she was feeling. That electric, almost painful flutter of anticipation that had kept her half awake for the past 3 nights, ever since Ethan had taken her hand outside the milliner's and told her he had something to say and that he needed her in front of the town when he said it. She'd understood what that meant. Or she'd thought she had. Caldwell was a town of about 400 people depending on what season it was and whether the mining crews were passing through. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 lines of hills, close enough to the river to make farming possible and far enough from the railroad to make everything harder than it needed to be. The main street was wide and unpaved and turned to mud in spring and cracked adobe in summer, and on any given weekday morning there were enough people out moving between the general store and the feed mill and the land office and the barber shop that a public moment in Caldwell wasn't really public so much as it was permanent. People remembered what they saw in the middle of that street for years. Clara knew that. She'd lived in this town her whole life, and she knew better than most how long a public moment could last, how it could follow a person from one end of the year to the other like a stone tied around their neck. She'd had her share of those moments, the daughter of a dead farmer and a mother who'd lost her mind to fever when Clara was 11. She'd grown up on the unpretty edge of everyone else's lives, wearing clothes that were always slightly wrong, always a season behind or a size off, always noticeably not quite right in a way that children noticed first and adults noticed quietly ever after. She'd grown up being the girl people felt sorry for, and then when she got older she became the woman people didn't quite know what to do with. Not ugly, exactly, but not the kind of pretty that Caldwell rewarded. She was too sharp in some places and too soft in others. Her nose had a bump in it from when she'd fallen from the fence post at age 9. Her hands were rough from work. She wasn't small and she wasn't delicate, and she didn't flutter or simper or laugh at the right moments. Ethan Cross had noticed her anyway. That was the miracle of it, or what she'd believed was the miracle. Ethan was 27 and he ran the livery his uncle had left him, and he was broad-shouldered and easy with his smile, and he had the kind of loose, comfortable confidence that came from having always been liked. He'd started paying attention to Clara about 8 months back, sitting near her at the Sunday socials, walking her home from the general store, bringing her a paper bag of lemon drops one afternoon like it was nothing, like he just happened to think of her. She hadn't trusted it at first. She wasn't built for trusting things that felt too good. But he'd kept coming back. He'd kept showing up. And gradually, the way water will eventually wear down even the most stubborn stone, she'd let herself believe that maybe this was what happened when you survived long enough. Maybe the town stopped seeing you as the tragedy you'd been born into and started seeing you as the person you'd made yourself into. Maybe Ethan Cross had seen that person all along. She'd let herself believe it. She was walking down the main street at 9:30, the sun already climbing and throwing long gold bars of light across the storefronts, when she saw that Ethan had gathered a crowd. That was the only way to put it. Gathered. like he'd gone around and collected people beforehand, arranged them. The Whitfield brothers were leaning against the post outside the barber shop. Margaret Holt and her sister Ruth were standing near the water trough with their heads together. Old Pete Dawes had come out of the general store and left the door swinging behind him. Sheriff Burrell was out on his porch with his coffee, and he hadn't gone back inside. Ethan was standing in the middle of the street. He saw her coming, and his face did something she couldn't read at that distance, something quick and complicated, and he held up one hand like he was flagging down a carriage. "Clara," he called, loud enough for everyone. She stopped walking about 15 feet from him. The dust was fine and dry under her boots, and the morning smelled like the river and manure, and the bread someone had started baking early at the hotel kitchen. "Ethan," she said. He was grinning, that easy grin. She'd loved that grin. She'd told herself she loved it. And standing there watching it now, she felt her stomach tighten, with something that wasn't quite dread, and wasn't quite joy, and was uncomfortably close to both. He reached into his coat pocket. She saw the ring box. Her breath went somewhere she couldn't find it. He opened the box, and it was a ring, small, simple, a thin band with a chip of something pale at the center, not expensive, but real, genuinely real. And he held it up so the sun caught it and so everyone could see, and he said, "I've been thinking about what I want, Clara Whitmore. Spent a good while thinking about it." She was barely breathing. "I had myself convinced," he said. "I really did." He was still grinning. She watched the grin and she thought, something is wrong with the grin. There was something behind it she hadn't seen before or hadn't let herself see. Something that wasn't affection and wasn't nerves, but was instead a kind of performance, a kind of enjoyment that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the crowd standing around them watching. "Convinced of what?" she managed. He tilted his head, looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they're deciding they don't want. "That I could marry something that looks like you," he said. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. 2 seconds where Clara's brain refused to process the sentences real, where it presented her with the words and then immediately suggested they were in the wrong order, or she'd misheard, or the wind had garbled them somehow. Then the laughter started. Not everyone laughed. She knew that afterward when she was able to think about it with any clarity at all. Most people were probably just standing there in some version of the same frozen shock she was experiencing. But the laughter that did come was loud, and it came from more than one direction, and it was the kind of laughter that didn't need many voices to fill a street. Ethan let the laughter settle before he kept going, and that was the part that lodged itself deepest, the way he waited for it, the way he let the crowd settle before he spoke again, like a man who knew how to work a room. "I gave it real consideration," he said. He was enjoying himself. That was what she saw now, finally, fully. He was enjoying himself in a way that made her stomach turn. "I thought maybe a man could overlook certain things if the rest was agreeable, but I've thought it through and I've decided I'd rather not spend the next 40 years looking at that face across the breakfast table." He reached out and held the ring over the dirt. He dropped it. It hit the dust with a small, almost inaudible sound, and it sat there between them in the street, catching the sun, and Ethan tucked his hands into his pockets and shrugged and said, "I think you'd better keep walking, Clara. Some folks are just not meant for certain things." Then he turned around and walked back toward the livery, and a few of the Whitfield brothers called something after him that she couldn't hear over the roaring in her own ears, and she was left standing there in her best dress with her pinned-up hair and her rough hands and a ring in the dirt in front of her that wasn't even hers and never had been. She didn't cry. That was the thing she would hold on to in the days and weeks after. She didn't cry in the street. She didn't pick up the ring. She didn't run. She didn't say a word. She stood there in the quiet that settled over the crowd after the laughter dropped away. And she felt the eyes on her, Margaret Holt's careful pity, and old Pete Dawes's uncomfortable fascination, and Sheriff Burrell watching from his porch like he was sorry he hadn't gone back inside after all, and she breathed through it. She looked at the ring in the dirt for a long moment. Then she turned around and walked back to the boarding house, her shoulders straight, her jaw set, her hands folded in front of her like she had somewhere specific to be. She made it up the stairs and through the door of her room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and that was when her hands started shaking. She had $23.14. She had the blue dress and two other dresses, one brown and one gray, both practical, nothing else. She had her mother's silver thimble in a small wooden box. She had her sewing kit and a knife and her father's old coat that was too big for her but warm. She had no family left, no cousins, no aunts, no one in Caldwell who would invite her to their table for any reason beyond obligation. And after this morning, she couldn't even be sure of the obligation. Nell Patterson came up around noon and stood in the doorway with the expression of a woman who'd already heard and was doing her best. "You don't have to decide anything today," Nell said. "I need to decide today," Clara said. "Clara, I can't stay here." She said it plainly, not dramatically, just the fact of it. "Every single day I stay in this town, I'm going to be the woman from this morning. That's what they'll see when they look at me. That's the only thing I'll be to them, for as long as I'm here." Nell was quiet for a moment. She was a practical woman, Nell, and she didn't argue with practical truths. "I've got a little saved," Nell offered. "If you need, I don't need money." Clara picked up her mother's thimble box and turned it over in her hands. "I need work, real work, somewhere that isn't here." She went to the general store that afternoon because she had to. She needed salt pork and flour if she was going to travel, and she didn't have the particular luxury of avoiding necessity even on the worst days of her life. She kept her eyes forward, and she kept moving, and she had almost made it to the counter when she heard Ethan's voice behind her. She hadn't seen him come in, talking to someone near the seed bins in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Man does himself no favors settling for what's available," he was saying. "I almost made a serious mistake." The woman he was talking to made a sympathetic sound. Clara set her things on the counter. She paid for them. Tom Ellison behind the register had the grace not to look at her directly, which she appreciated more than she would have thought possible. She was walking back toward the door when someone stepped into her path. She looked up, expecting Ethan, and found instead a man she didn't recognize. He was big, not in the way that was meant to be noticed, but in the way of someone who'd done hard physical work for a long time and had simply ended up that way. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with a weathered face and dark eyes under the brim of a plain hat, and clothes that were clean but worn in a way that said he worked in them. There were calluses on his hands that made hers look soft by comparison. He wasn't looking at Ethan. He was looking at her. "Heard you might be looking for work," he said. Clara blinked. "I haven't told anyone that." "No," he said. "You haven't. I worked it out on my own." He paused. "My cook quit 2 weeks ago. I've got 12 men and no one who can do better than beans and hardtack, and I'm losing patience with it. The work's hard, the hours are early, and the pay is fair, which is more than most places out this way will tell you up front." He said all of this in a voice that was low and even, with no particular sales pitch in it, like he was reading from a list. "I'm not looking for someone delicate, and I'm not looking for someone impressive. I'm looking for someone willing to work." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Who are you?" she asked. "Silas Granger," he said. "I run a cattle ranch about 12 miles north of here, Granger Ridge." She'd heard the name. She thought most people in Caldwell had heard the name. Granger Ridge was one of the bigger outfits in the territory. Cattle and some horses had been in operation for over a decade. She didn't know much about Silas Granger specifically, except that he wasn't a man who came into town often, which was either a sign of a man who was too busy to socialize or a man people kept a distance from. And at the moment, she wasn't entirely sure which. "Why are you offering me work?" she said. He seemed to consider the question as genuine rather than rhetorical. "Because you were in that store buying salt pork and flour like you're getting ready to go somewhere," he said, "and because of the way you walked out of that street this morning." She felt her face go tight. "You saw that?" "I did." "And you're here because you felt sorry for me?" "No." The word was simple and immediate. "I'm here because I need a cook. The rest of it isn't my business." He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat. "The offer's there. You can say no." Clara stood in the doorway of Tom Ellison's general store with her salt pork and her flour and the specific shame of a morning she would never be able to unhappen. And she looked at Silas Granger's steady, weathered face. She thought about staying. She thought about waking up tomorrow, in this town, and the next day, and the day after that, and what each one of those days would look like. The slow accumulation of other people's memory of her worst moment layered on top of her like stones. "When do you need an answer?" she said. "Hour," he said. "I'm heading back this afternoon." She was back at the boarding house in 20 minutes. She packed what she had. It didn't take long, 24 years of a life that had never had much in the way of possessions. The 2 practical dresses, her sewing kit, her mother's thimble, her father's coat, the $23.14. Nell stood in the hallway outside her door and watched her pack and didn't say anything for a long time. "You don't know this man," Nell finally said. "I don't know anyone," Clara said. "I've lived here my whole life, and this morning proved I don't know a single person in this town." "That's not fair." "Maybe not." Clara folded her father's coat and pressed it into the bottom of her bag. "But it's what I've got." Nell came into the room then and sat on the end of the bed. She was 50-something, with gray-streaked hair and hands that had known their share of hard work, and she had been as close to a mother figure as Clara had had since her own mother had gone. She didn't try to talk Clara out of it again. She just sat there while Clara packed, and that was its own kind of kindness. "He's got a reputation for being hard," Nell said at last. "Granger, not mean. People don't say mean, just hard. Keeps to himself, runs a tight operation." "Good," Clara said. "You sure?" Clara looked around the small room, the cracked mirror, the iron stove, the window that looked out over the back alley. $23.14 and a mother's thimble and a father's coat and a whole town full of people who had watched a man drop a ring in the dirt and laughed. "I'm sure," she said. She met Silas at the edge of town at the agreed time, and he had a wagon and a pair of steady-looking horses and a manner that suggested he was not going to make conversation about her morning if she didn't ask him to, which she did not. They rode out of Caldwell heading north, and Clara kept her face forward and her hands folded in her lap, and she did not look back. She thought about it for about the first mile. The particular pull of a place you've spent your whole life, the gravity of it even when it's hurt you. It doesn't let go cleanly. She felt it like a hook somewhere behind her ribs, the town pulling at her even as the wheels turned and the distance widened. She didn't look back. After a few miles, Silas spoke. "You ever cook for more than a household?" he asked. "I cooked for Nell Patterson's boarding house for 2 years, Clara said. Mornings and evenings. Never less than 8 people, sometimes close to 20 during the mining season." He nodded. "Can you stretch a supply run?" "Depends how far you're stretching it. 2 weeks between resupply if the trail's bad. Then I need to know your stores before I can answer that." He nodded again, like this was exactly the right answer, and said nothing else for a while. Clara watched the landscape change around them. The town falling away, the valley broadening out, the hills rising on either side and casting long afternoon shadows across the road. The air smelled different out here. Drier, more open. She breathed it in. "You'll have your own quarters," Silas said after a while. "Small, behind the main kitchen. It's private." "That's fine." "The men know to keep their distance from the cook's space. Anyone who doesn't will hear from me." She glanced at him. He was watching the road, his hands easy on the reins. "You lay out the rules before problems happen," she said. "I try to," he said. "Saves time." She looked back at the road ahead. "What happened to the last cook?" she asked. "His mother got sick. He went back east." "And before him?" Pause. "Couldn't handle the isolation." Clara considered this. "How isolated are we talking?" 12 miles from town is 12 miles. In bad weather, it's more. He kept his eyes on the road. There's no Sunday social, no gossip, no one showing up to see what you're about. You work, you eat, you sleep. That's what it is. She thought about that for a moment, the absence of a Sunday social, the absence of a whole town full of people who knew every bad thing that had ever happened to her. "That sounds," she said carefully, "like exactly what I need." She saw the ranch as they came over the last ridge before the valley leveled off. Granger Ridge sprawling across the base of the hills in the late afternoon light, the main house substantial and plain, a long, low bunkhouse to the east of it, barns and stables and corrals arranged in the practical geometry of a working operation rather than anything meant to impress. It wasn't beautiful. It was functional, which she decided was better. There were men working in the corrals, and a few of them looked up when the wagon came in. She felt their eyes on her the way she'd felt eyes her whole life, and she didn't flinch from it. Silas pulled the wagon up in front of the main house and climbed down and came around to take her bag, which she handed over without argument. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward a side door. "I'll show you the stores and the layout. You can figure out supper." "Tonight?" 12 men ate beans and dried beef for the last 3 days, he said. "They'd appreciate a change." Clara looked at the side door. She looked at the corrals where the men had gone back to their work, mostly with one or two still watching from a distance. "What do you have?" she said. "Come see." The kitchen was bigger than she'd expected. A long room with 2 iron stoves, a heavy work table down the center, shelves along the east wall stocked with the dry goods of a working ranch, a cold room off the back where salted meat hung and root vegetables had been stored in crates. It wasn't organized. The last cook had either been careless or had organized in some system that made sense only to himself, and the result was a jumble that would need addressing before she could work in it properly. But the equipment was solid. The stoves were good. The knives were decent. Clara put her bag in the corner and walked the room with her hands behind her back. "Flour, cornmeal, dried beans," she said, reading the shelves. "You've got lard, you've got salt pork, you've got—" She pulled a crate from the back corner. "Dried apples. Good." She looked around. "I can do a proper supper tonight. Tomorrow I'll need to know what you want as a standing weekly menu and what your budget allows." "The budget's reasonable," Silas said. "I'll need more than reasonable as a number." He told her the number. She filed it away. "All right," she said. She pulled her hair back, found an apron on a hook by the cold room, and got to work. She made biscuits and salt pork gravy and a pot of beans cooked properly with what flavoring she could find, and fried apples on the side because she'd found enough dried ones and enough sugar to make them work. It wasn't extraordinary. It was honest food, made well, with attention given to it. She rang the supper bell at 6. The men came in and sat at the long table in the dining room adjacent to the kitchen, and she watched them from the doorway as they filled their plates, and she saw the moment the food registered on their faces. The slight pause. The second helping reached for sooner than expected. The specific quiet that comes over a group of hungry men who are suddenly eating something that tastes like it was made by a person rather than assembled out of obligation. Nobody said anything to her directly. A few of them nodded when they brought their plates back to the window. One man, young, with a gap between his front teeth and a cheerful face, said, "Ma'am," and seemed to mean it as genuine respect rather than irony. Silas ate at the end of the table and didn't say anything either, but when she was cleaning up after supper, she heard him tell someone in the hallway that supper had been decent. Decent. She held on to that word while she washed the pots. It was a small word. It was the most ordinary word. But standing in the kitchen of a ranch 12 miles from the town where a man had dropped a ring in the dirt for sport, scrubbing a pot that needed scrubbing, with a job that was hers because she'd earned it in the past 3 hours. Decent felt like the beginning of something. She wasn't sure what. She didn't need to know yet. She hung the pot back on its hook. She wiped down the work table. She banked the fire in the stove. She went to her quarters, small, private, behind the kitchen, exactly what he'd promised, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at her hands. They were still shaking, slightly, not from fear this time. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed. She was 12 miles from Caldwell. She had her mother's thimble and her father's coat and $23.14. She had a kitchen that was hers to run, and 12 men who had eaten well tonight for the first time in 3 days, and a rancher with calloused hands and a plain manner who had offered her honest work without asking for anything she wasn't willing to give. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a very long time, the not knowing felt like space rather than falling. She lay down on the narrow bed. She didn't cry. She slept. She was up at 4:30 the next morning, not because anyone told her to be, not because Silas had given her a schedule or laid out expectations beyond what supper had already established. She was up because 4:30 was when the work started if you wanted to have breakfast ready before men who'd been outside since first light came in, hungry and short on patience. And Clara had learned that lesson in Nell Patterson's boarding house before she'd learned much else. The kitchen was cold and dark when she came in from her quarters. and she got the stove going before she did anything else, crouching in front of it with the small kindling she'd stacked the night before, coaxing the flame up until it caught properly. Then she put water on for coffee and stood at the work table in the half-dark while the kitchen slowly warmed around her, making a list in her head of what the morning needed. She'd thought about the kitchen organization the night before while she was trying to sleep. The previous cook system, if it could be called that, had things stored by size rather than function, which meant you were crossing the room 3 times for every dish you tried to make. She started moving things before the coffee was even done, shifting the dry goods to cluster near the work table where she'd actually use them, clearing the shelf by the cold room for daily use items, hanging the most reached for tools within arm's reach of the main stove. It took about 40 minutes. When she was done, it was still dark outside, but the kitchen made sense now, and that was the kind of order that would pay back the time spent on it every single day. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when she heard boots on the floorboards outside. The door opened and a man came in. Not Silas, but one of the ranch hands, the one she'd clocked the night before as the most likely to test something. He was thick through the chest, maybe 40, with a beard that needed attention and eyes that were measuring her in a way that had nothing to do with the food. "Thought they'd sent us a washerwoman?" he said, leaning in the doorway. Clara kept her hands on the biscuit pan. "I need this doorway clear in about 2 minutes," she said. "I've got a pot to move." He didn't move. "Where's your sense of humor?" "I left it in my other apron." She set the pan on the work table and looked at him directly. "I'm not going to have this conversation while I've got breakfast to finish. If you've got a problem with me being here, take it somewhere I'm not." He stared at her for a moment. There was a beat where it could have gone either way. Then Silas appeared behind him in the doorway. She hadn't heard him coming, but there he was, still pulling on his coat, and he looked at the scene with a single steady glance that took in the ranch hand in the doorway and Clara at the work table and the specific quality of the silence between them. "Decker," he said. "Morning, boss." "Breakfast ready in 2 minutes," Clara said. "You want to be at the table, or you want to keep standing in the kitchen door?" Decker moved. Silas looked at Clara once, briefly, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not quite apologetic, not quite reassuring, something more practical than either. And then he followed Decker out. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. The first week was its own kind of education. She learned the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn a new language. By immersion, by necessity, by making enough small mistakes that the shape of the right way gradually becomes visible. She learned that the crew ate in 2 shifts during branding season, when half the men were out before first light and the other half came in at staggered hours. She learned that a man named Walt had a stomach that couldn't handle too much salt pork, and that he'd never tell her himself, but his face would tell her for him. She learned that the young one with the gap teeth was named Jesse, and that he'd been with the ranch since he was 16, and treated the place with a particular loyalty that expressed itself as genuine helpfulness rather than the performative kind. Jesse was the one who started helping her carry supply crates from the wagon on resupply days without being asked. Jesse was the one who told her, quietly, one afternoon near the end of the first week, that the men thought the food was the best they'd had since a cook named Hector left 3 years ago. "That's high praise, apparently," Jesse said. "Hector set a good bar?" "Hector could do things with a dried bean you wouldn't believe." Clara smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled in about 10 days, and it surprised her a little. The ease of it, the way it came without effort. "I'll take it," she said. Decker didn't come back to the kitchen doorway after that first morning, but he found other ways to make his position known. Comments at the table delivered just loud enough, a certain emphasis on the cook when he referred to her that made it sound like a category rather than a person. She heard him once telling someone near the stable that Silas had gone soft, hiring on charity cases. She kept her mouth shut and her food good. It was Silas who handled Decker in the end, and not in any dramatic way. She found out about it secondhand from Jesse, who told her with some satisfaction that Silas had pulled Decker aside on a Wednesday afternoon and explained to him that the cook's position was permanent for as long as the cook wanted it, and that if Decker had opinions about that, he was welcome to find employment elsewhere. "Did Decker say anything?" Clara asked. "Not out loud," Jesse said. After that, Decker ate his meals without commentary, which was the most she'd asked for. About 2 weeks in, she made her first real error. It wasn't dramatic. She'd miscalculated the flour stores against the resupply schedule and came up short midweek. Not enough to actually run out, but enough that the biscuits she'd planned for Thursday would need to become cornbread instead, and the pies she'd been intending for Saturday would have to wait. She told Silas at supper. He looked at her across the table with that even expression that gave very little away. How short? 8 pounds. I can work around it. What does working around it look like? She told him. He listened. He nodded once. Don't stretch the cornmeal too far, he said. Men work better when there's enough. I know that. I know you know. He picked up his coffee. I'm just saying. She almost said something back. There was a flash of irritation in her that surprised her, but she let it pass. He wasn't wrong, and he wasn't saying it to correct her so much as he was saying it the way a man says things when he's used to having all the information in the room at the same time. She recalibrated the stores that night and wrote out a more precise tracking system on a piece of paper she nailed to the inside of the cold room door. She didn't miscalculate again. It was in the 3rd week that she rode into Caldwell for the first time since leaving. She needed to go. The resupply list had items Tom Ellison's general store was the only source for within reasonable distance, and sending Jessie with a handwritten list felt like asking someone else to face something she hadn't faced yet herself, which wasn't a thing she was willing to do. She drove the wagon in on a Thursday morning, and she tied the horses in front of the general store, and she went inside with her list. Tom Ellison was behind the counter. He looked up, and for a moment there was that familiar, uncomfortable awareness moving across his face, the recognition, the quick calculation of what to say, and then he settled into something professional, and she was grateful for it. She was reading labels on the back shelf when she heard the door open and felt rather than saw the particular shift in the room's atmosphere. Well, Ethan's voice said, look who came back. She kept her eyes on the shelf for a moment, just a breath. Then she turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his hat pushed back and his hands in his pockets, and the same easy, comfortable grin she'd spent 8 months believing in. There were 2 men behind him she didn't know well. Hands from one of the smaller operations, probably, or men passing through. Ethan, she said. Didn't think we'd see you back so soon, he said. Figured Granger's place would have chewed you up and spat you out by now. I'm picking up supplies. She turned back to the shelf. How long you reckon it lasts? He asked, and she could hear in his voice that he was performing again. Performing for the men behind him, for Tom Ellison behind the counter, for anyone else who might have had a reason to wander in. Woman like you, out at a cattle ranch? No offense, Clara, but the outdoors isn't exactly... I've got a list to fill, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn around. I'm not here to talk to you. A pause. You've got nerve, I'll give you that, Ethan said. She picked up the item she'd been looking at and put it in her basket and moved to the next shelf. Her hands were steady. She was aware of that. 2 weeks ago, in this same store, she'd paid for salt pork and flour and barely held together, and now her hands were steady. She finished her list. She paid Tom Ellison. She walked out. She was loading the crates into the wagon bed when she heard the store door open behind her. She kept loading. You should be careful, Ethan said. He wasn't performing now. His voice had dropped. The audience left inside. Granger's a hard man. You're going to end up in a worse spot than you left. Clara set the last crate in the wagon and turned around. She looked at him. Really looked at him. At the handsome, easy face and the comfortable stance and the fundamental smallness of a man who only felt big when he was reducing someone else. You dropped a ring in the dirt to make people laugh, she said. And I'm still here. Go back inside, Ethan. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and drove back toward the ranch. She didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't quite the right word. She felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. Something that lived closer to the bone. Silas noticed she'd been into town when she pulled back in at midday. He came out to help unload without being asked, which she'd started to realize was a habit of his, appearing at practical moments without commentary. Any trouble? He said. She handed him a crate. Nothing I couldn't handle. He looked at her for a moment. Cross give you a hard time? He tried. Silas took the crate and was quiet for a beat. He's going to keep at it, he said. He's the kind of man who doesn't like being answered back to. I know what kind of man he is. I know you do. He took the next crate. I'm just saying, don't go into town alone if you can help it. Not because you can't handle yourself. Because two is harder to mess with than one. She handed him the next crate. She thought about arguing the point. She thought about the fact that she'd managed alone her whole life and didn't need an escort. But then she thought about what he was actually saying underneath the words, which wasn't you can't handle it, but something closer to you don't have to handle it by yourself anymore. And the argument dissolved somewhere in her chest before it reached her mouth. All right, she said. They unloaded the rest of the wagon in silence, which was the most comfortable silence she'd experienced in a long time. By the end of the first month, the kitchen was entirely hers, not just in the organizational sense, though it was that. The shelves logical now, the stores tracked, the daily and weekly rhythms worked out to the point where the operation ran without friction. It was hers in the sense that the men knew it and accepted it, that the doorway was no longer a place where anyone stood testing the air. When the kitchen door opened before meals, it was Jesse asking if she needed help with the heavy pots, or Walt checking if there was something his stomach could manage without incident, or one of the other hands with a reasonable question delivered respectfully. She started doing more than she'd been hired to do, and she did it not because anyone asked, but because she noticed what was needed. The ranch had no system for tracking which supplies were running low, so she made one. The meal schedule had never been written down anywhere, so she wrote it down and posted it where the hands could see it and plan around it. She noticed that the men who came in from the far pasture on the late shift were cold and tired, and that hot soup kept better than anything else, so she started keeping a pot on the back burner on cold evenings without being asked. Small things. Practical things. The kind of things that didn't announce themselves but made the daily life of 12 men and one rancher run more smoothly. Silas noticed. She wasn't sure how much he noticed until one evening when she was cleaning up after supper, and he came into the kitchen. Unusual. He was not a man who appeared in the kitchen outside of meals. And he stood at the work table and looked at her tracking system on the cold room door. You did this? He said. It was needed. He was quiet for a moment, reading through it. You could charge extra for something like this. She hadn't thought about that. I didn't do it for that. I know. He looked at her. I'm going to pay you more anyway. You don't have to. I know I don't. He went back to studying the chart. You're doing work beyond the scope. It gets compensated. He said it in the same plain, no-argument tone he used for most things, and she'd learned by now that arguing against that tone was an exercise in diminishing returns. She turned back to the stove. There was something specific about being seen without asking for it, about doing work because it needed doing and having someone notice without having to be told. She'd spent so much of her life working for recognition that never came, that this felt almost disorienting in its simplicity. She didn't say thank you. It didn't seem like the right word for what had happened. Good night, she said instead. Night, said Silas, and went back to the main house. She saw Ethan once more that month on a second supply run she'd made with Jesse. He was across the street outside the barber shop, and when he saw her, he said something to the man beside him, and they both laughed, and she felt the familiar cold pull of it in her stomach, the conditioned response of a lifetime of being laughed at in this town. But then Jesse, walking beside her, said without looking up from the supply list, Ignore him. He's been making a fool of himself all over town since you left. People are starting to notice. She looked at Jesse. What do you mean? I mean, he goes around talking about you like you're some cautionary tale, and people are getting tired of it. Jesse folded the list and put it in his pocket. A man who has to keep telling the same story about someone usually means the story isn't going the way he wanted. She looked back across the street at Ethan. He'd already looked away. Moving down the street, the laughter already done. She kept walking. The cold thing in her stomach didn't disappear entirely. She didn't expect it to. You didn't undo a lifetime in a month, but it was smaller than it had been. And the thing sitting alongside it now, the thing that had grown in the kitchen of Granger Ridge Ranch in the space of 30 days of hard, honest, necessary work, that thing was bigger. She was still figuring out what to call it. For now, she picked up the first item on the supply list and carried it to the wagon, and Jesse walked beside her, and the afternoon light came across the valley the way it did out here, wide and clean and indifferent to all the small human dramas playing out beneath it. And she breathed it in. She was still here. That was enough, for now. The trouble with Ethan Cross didn't announce itself. That was the thing about men like him. They didn't come at you straight on, because coming straight on required a kind of courage they'd never actually developed underneath all that easy confidence. They came sideways. They worked through other people, through paperwork and whisper campaigns, and the particular leverage that came from knowing how a small town's machinery operated and which gears to press. Clara had been at Granger Ridge for 6 weeks when she first heard Silas use the word easement in a tone that meant something had gone wrong. She heard it through the wall of the main house. She hadn't been eavesdropping. She'd been returning a pot she'd borrowed from the house kitchen, and she'd stopped at the sound of Silas's voice going tight in a way she hadn't heard before. He was talking to a man named Roy Callum, who handled the legal and land paperwork for the ranch, and the conversation she caught the end of was enough to understand the shape of the problem even without all the details. Someone had filed a challenge on the eastern grazing easement. The land wasn't in dispute exactly. Granger Ridge had used it for over a decade, but the legal documentation was old and incomplete in the way that frontier paperwork often was. And if the challenge held up, the ranch would lose access to the best seasonal pasture on the eastern ridge, which would cut the viable herd size by a third. She set the pot down inside the door and left without interrupting. That evening, she asked Jesse quietly whether he knew anything about it. Jesse's face did something complicated. "People are saying Cross has been talking to a lawyer out of Harlan County," he said, "someone who specializes in old land claims." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Ethan doesn't own land anywhere near that easement." "Doesn't have to." Jesse picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "He just has to create enough of a legal mess that it costs Silas time and money and grazing season to sort it out." She thought about that, about the specific mechanics of it, the way a man could do real damage without ever getting his hands dirty or his name attached to anything obviously wrong. It was almost elegant in its smallness, which was fitting because that was what Ethan Cross was underneath the easy grin and the comfortable confidence. He was small. He'd always been small. He just needed other people to be smaller to feel it. She didn't say anything to Silas about what she'd heard. It wasn't her place, and he wasn't the kind of man who wanted his problems witnessed unless he'd chosen to share them. But she watched him more carefully after that. Whatever legal pressure Ethan was applying, Silas absorbed it without letting it change the rhythm of the ranch. He was away for 2 days in the middle of that week, rode into Caldwell to meet with Roy Callum and whoever else needed meeting with, and came back with dust on his coat and an expression that had been pressed flat in the way of a man who'd dealt with something unpleasant and filed it away. He ate supper quietly. The men knew not to push. Clara refilled his coffee without being asked and didn't say anything, and he looked up at her briefly and gave a short nod that wasn't quite gratitude, but was something in that direction. She went back to the kitchen. 2 days later, Decker, who she'd thought was done with his complications, came in at breakfast and said, loud enough for the table, that he'd heard in town that Granger Ridge might be in legal trouble with the land office, and that a man should think about his situation if the outfit he worked for was on shaky ground. The table went quiet. Clara was at the stove. She kept her eyes on what she was doing. Silas's voice came from the far end of the table, measured and even. "Anyone who's worried about the situation is free to draw their wages and go. I'm not holding anyone here." A pause. "I didn't say I was going," Decker said. "Then eat your breakfast," Silas said. Nobody else said anything. Jesse caught Clara's eye across the room and gave a small shrug that meant this is how it goes sometimes. And she turned back to the stove. The fire started on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after she'd heard that first conversation through the wall. Clara had been in her quarters for about an hour. It was past 9. The kitchen cleaned and closed. The ranch settled into the particular nighttime quiet of a working cattle operation where men were up before dawn. She'd been reading, or trying to read, the same page of the same book for 20 minutes while her mind ran circles she couldn't stop when she smelled it. Smoke. Not the wood stove kind, not the familiar contained smell of banked fires and warm chimneys. This was something wilder and hotter, and it hit the back of her throat wrong. She was out of her quarters and through the kitchen before she'd fully decided to move. The south stable was on fire. It was already bad when she got outside. The west wall fully involved, flames climbing toward the roof in that fast, hungry way that meant the wood had been dry and the fire had been burning for longer than anyone had noticed. Two of the ranch hands were already outside, running toward the water barrel, yelling for the others. Jesse was at the stable doors trying to get them open, but the latch mechanism on the main doors had caught or jammed, and he was throwing his weight against it without success. She saw Silas. He was already running toward the side of the stable, the south face where there was a smaller access door used for equipment, not animals, and she understood what he was doing before he did it. The horses were in there. 3 of the ranch's working horses and Silas's own, a dark bay that she'd seen him ride every morning since she arrived, and had understood, without being told, was not just a horse. He hit the side door with his shoulder, and it gave, and he went in. The smoke billowed out of the open door in a thick, dark column. Claire stood in the yard and watched the door and the fire climbing above it, and she felt the particular sensation of a decision that isn't really a decision because your body has already made it. The side window on the east face was narrow. Too narrow for Silas, probably, but possibly not for her. She grabbed the empty water bucket from the well rail, soaked the rag she kept tied at her apron for kitchen burns, pressed it over her mouth and nose, and moved. She made it to the window without anyone seeing her go. Getting through it was not graceful. She knocked her shoulder on the frame and came down inside on her hands and knees on the stable floor, coughing before she'd even straightened up. The smoke inside low and thick in a way that made her eyes burn immediately. She pulled the wet rag tighter against her face. She could hear the horses, the panicked, high sound of animals in the presence of fire, that particular register that goes straight to the base of the brain, and she moved toward it, staying low, one hand along the stall panels to navigate. There were 2 horses still in the far stalls. She found the first one, a roan she knew was called Bishop, who'd thrown 2 riders this summer, according to Jesse, screaming and circling in the confined space. She got the stall latch open and jumped clear as he bolted past her toward the door Silas had come through, which she could hear him working on the other side. The second horse was Silas's bay. He was down on his front knees in the back corner, which was wrong. Horses didn't go down in fires, not unless something else was wrong. And she moved toward him fast and found the lead rope tangled in the stall hardware, wrapped twice in a way that had him pinned close to the ground when the smoke had probably made him try to sink beneath it. "Easy," she said, which was useless, but she said it anyway. "Easy, easy." She got her hands on the rope and worked it. Her eyes were streaming now, and she couldn't stop coughing, and the heat from the west wall had become a physical pressure she could feel through her clothes, and the rope was twisted in a way that required both hands and more concentration than she had available. She got it. The bay lurched upright, nearly knocked her into the wall, and she grabbed the lead and pulled, hard, moving back toward the window, even though she already knew she wasn't fitting back through the window with the horse. She moved toward Silas's door instead and hit it with her palm. "Silas!" The door swung in from the other side, and Silas was there, and his face in the firelight did something she'd never seen it do before. It went from controlled to something much less controlled in about half a second, and he grabbed her arm and the lead rope simultaneously and pulled them both through the door and out. The cold air hit her like a wall. She went down to her knees in the yard and coughed until she thought she might turn inside out. Around her she could hear men shouting and the bucket brigade working and the fire still burning. The stable was going to be a loss. She understood that. The structure itself was already too far gone. But the horses were out. All the horses were out. She could hear them at the far end of the yard, corralled against the fence, their breathing loud and ragged but alive. Someone put a hand on her back. Jesse, she thought, or one of the others. Then someone crouched in front of her, and it was Silas. And his face was close, and there was a burn on the back of his left hand. She could see even in the low light and soot along one side of his jaw, and he was looking at her with an expression she had absolutely no framework for. "You went in through the window," he said. She was still coughing. "Bay was tangled. I had him. You were at the door." She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I had a shorter route." He stared at her. "I'm fine," she said, which was approximately true. She'd hit her shoulder hard on the window frame, and she could already feel it stiffening, and her throat felt scraped raw, but she was upright and breathing, and none of those things were serious. "How's your hand?" He looked down at the burn on the back of his hand like he'd forgotten it was there. "Manageable," he said. They stayed like that for a moment, crouched in the yard while the stable burned and the men worked the water line and the horses stood at the far fence. And the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the comfortable kind she'd gotten used to. It had weight in it. Silas stood up and offered her his unburned hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. He held on to it for a second longer than necessary. Then he let go and turned toward the men and the fire and the work of it. And she stood in the yard breathing cold air and watched him go. They found the cause the next morning. Decker was gone. He'd drawn his wages, helped himself to them, technically, from the lockbox in the tack room that he'd had access to as a senior hand, and cleared out sometime in the night. He'd left behind a bunk that had been slept in and a note that said nothing useful except that he was moving on. It was Jesse who found, in the ash and char of the burned stable's west corner, the remains of what had been a lantern positioned in a way that lanterns didn't naturally end up. He brought Silas over and showed him without saying much, and Silas stood there and looked at it and was very still for a long moment. "Could have been an accident," Jesse said, in the tone of someone who didn't believe what they were saying but felt the need to put it out there. "Could have been," Silas said. Neither of them said Ethan's name. Clara, standing a few feet back, didn't say it either. She thought about what Jesse had told her weeks ago, about Ethan talking to a lawyer, about the easement challenge, about the specific kind of damage a small man could do through intermediaries. She thought about Decker and his particular resentment of her, which she'd attributed to wounded pride, but which in retrospect had the quality of something cultivated rather than organic. She didn't know for certain. She wasn't sure she'd ever know for certain, and the not knowing was its own kind of weight. "I need to rebuild the west wall before the rain comes," Silas said finally. He looked up from the ash. "Jesse, get me a materials count." "Yes, sir." They moved into the practical work of it, the way working people moved into everything. Because the work was there, and it needed doing, and the alternatives were standing in burned ash and feeling things that didn't fix anything. That afternoon, Silas found her in the kitchen. She was making bread. The repetitive physical work of it, the kneading, had always been useful for her mind on difficult days. And she heard him come in but didn't stop what she was doing. He pulled out the chair at the end of the work table and sat down, which he'd never done before, and watched her work for a moment. "How's the shoulder?" he said. She'd forgotten she'd mentioned it, or maybe she hadn't mentioned it, and he'd noticed how she'd been carrying her left arm. She wasn't sure. "Stiff," she said. "It's fine." He nodded. He had a cup of coffee he'd brought from the main house, and he turned it in his hands. "You didn't have to go in there," he said. Clara kept kneading. "We've had this conversation." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He stopped, set the coffee cup down. "I looked up and you were gone, and then I saw the window, and I couldn't—" He stopped again. She looked at him. She'd heard him trail off before. He wasn't a man who talked around things, so when he did it meant he was in territory he wasn't comfortable in, words he hadn't pre-cleared for himself. He was looking at the table. "There are people," he said, slowly, like he was working something out while he said it, "that you can't afford to lose, and you don't always know that about a person until something happens that makes it real." He picked up the coffee cup. "I didn't know it until I saw the window." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of her hands on the bread dough. Clara had spent 6 weeks learning this man in the way you learned a person through proximity and work, and the accumulated small evidence of who they were, the way he spoke to his men, the way he managed the ranch, the way he'd appeared in the general store on the worst morning of her life, and offered her honest work with no strings on it. She'd built an understanding of him that was made of practical pieces, useful and reliable, and she'd been careful not to build anything else on top of it because she'd learned expensive lessons about building on ground that looked solid. But here he was, sitting at her work table, turning a coffee cup in his hands, telling her something true. She turned the bread and pressed her palms into it. "I came in through the window because the horse was tangled and I was closer," she said. "That's the whole of it." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to apologize for it." "I'm not asking you to." He looked up. I'm trying to say something and I'm doing it badly. She met his eyes. You're doing fine, she said. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just enough. He picked up the coffee cup and stood. Supper tonight, he said, back to the even, practical tone. Whatever you see fit. I know my job, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He went back to the main house. Clara pressed her hands into the bread and felt the heat of the kitchen around her and thought about what he'd said, and about the stable burning and the rope tangled and the cold air after, and his hand in hers for that extra second before he'd let go. She kept her face neutral and her hands working, but something had shifted in her too. She wasn't ready to name it. She wasn't sure she had the right framework for it yet. Wasn't sure she trusted frameworks built on feeling after everything that had taught her to distrust them. But it was there, quiet and real, sitting alongside everything else she'd built in 6 weeks at this ranch. She shaped the bread and set it to rise and turned back to the stove. Outside, she could hear the men working on the burned stable. The sound of lumber being sorted, Jesse calling measurements, the ordinary noise of a ranch absorbing a hard thing and moving through it. She put a pot of water on. There was supper to make. The rebuilt stable wall went up in 5 days. It wasn't pretty. The new lumber didn't match the old in color or in weathering, and the west face had a patched, uneven look that would take years to blend in. But it was solid, and solid was what mattered. Silas ran his hand along the frame on the morning they finished it, checking joints the way a man checks something he's going to trust his livelihood to, and gave a short nod that meant it would do. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. Something had changed in the weeks since the fire. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to and name cleanly, but in the small, persistent ways that actual change usually happened. Silas came into the kitchen more often, not intrusively, never in a way that disrupted her work or presumed on her space, but with a regularity that hadn't been there before. He'd sit at the end of the work table with his coffee in the morning sometimes, before the crew was up, and they'd talk about the ranch or the weather or the supply situation, or they wouldn't talk at all, just occupy the same warm room while the dark outside went gray and then gold. She'd stopped bracing for those moments to mean something they didn't. She'd started letting herself believe they meant what they seemed to mean, which was its own kind of courage for a woman who'd built most of her adult defenses around not believing things that felt too good. The easement challenge was still unresolved. Roy Callum had been back twice, and Silas had ridden into Caldwell 3 more times for meetings she wasn't privy to, and the outcome was still uncertain in a way that put a low-grade tension through the whole ranch operation. The kind of tension that didn't spike but didn't go away, that lived in the background of everything like weather coming. She was thinking about that tension, about the eastern pasture and the paperwork and the shape of what Ethan was doing. When Jesse came into the kitchen on a Thursday morning, looking like he had something to say, and wasn't sure he should say it, she'd gotten good at reading Jesse. "What?" she said. He set his hat on the table and turned it in his hands. "I was in Caldwell yesterday." "I know, you did the resupply run." "While I was there, I ran into Pete Alderman. His boy works at the land office, does the filing and the copying." Jesse stopped, organizing his words. "Pete said his boy overheard something 2 days ago. A man from Harlan County came in with a lawyer and they filed something with the county recorder. Something about the eastern grazing boundary. Pete's boy didn't get the details, but he said it looked like a formal claim, not just a challenge." Clara put down what she was doing. A formal claim was different from a legal challenge. A challenge required Silas to defend an existing easement, costly and time-consuming, but winnable. A formal claim was an assertion of competing ownership, which created a different kind of legal problem entirely, one that could tie up the land in dispute for months or longer, making it unusable during the process regardless of how it resolved. "When did it get filed?" she said. "Day before yesterday." She was already untying her apron. "Where's Silas?" "North Pasture, I think. He rode out at—" She was past him before he finished the sentence. She found Silas at the north fence line, working with 2 of the men on a section that needed restringing, and she came up on horseback. She'd been riding more these past weeks, enough that it was no longer the uncomfortable exercise it had been when she first arrived, and he looked up when he heard her coming and read her face before she said a word. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She told him what Jessie had told her. She kept it brief and factual because that was what the moment needed, and she watched his face do the thing it did with difficult information. Absorb it, process it somewhere interior, come back out the other side with the same even expression wearing slightly more weight. He was quiet for a moment. "If they've filed a formal claim," he said, "I've got maybe 10 days before the county recorder's office sends me formal notice. After that, the land goes into dispute status, which means you can't use it during grazing season, which means I lose this year's eastern pasture and probably next year's while the lawyers work it out." He pulled off his gloves. "And the lawyers cost money that comes out of the same place the herd revenue comes from." She looked at him. "Roy Callum needs to file a counterclaim before the dispute status kicks in. If your documentation on the easement predates their claim, it does. But the documentation is old and some of it's in bad shape. Roy's been trying to get certified copies from the original land office in Harlan County for 3 months, and they keep sending back incomplete records. Can you go get them yourself?" He paused. "In person," she said. "Not by post. You ride to Harlan County, you walk into that land office, you stand in front of whoever needs to be stood in front of, and you ask for every piece of paper with your family's name on it going back to the original grant. It's a 2-day ride, but you'd have what you need." He was looking at her with that expression she'd learned to read, as I'm thinking about what you just said rather than dismissing it. Roy's been trying for 3 months, she said. "You go yourself. Your name is on the land. That means something when you're standing there in person." Silas was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the fence line, at the north pasture stretching out behind it, at the hills beyond that where the eastern grazing land sat waiting on the outcome of a legal fight started by a man who didn't want land, just wanted to damage the person who had it. "I'd need to leave tomorrow," he said. "Then leave tomorrow." He looked at her again. "You'd be running things here." She held his gaze. "I've been running the kitchen for 2 months. I know this ranch. The men know me. Jessie knows what needs doing in the fields. You'd be gone 4 days at most." He picked up his gloves and turned them over. "I know you can handle it," he said. "And the simplicity of it, no qualification, no I think or I'm sure you'll manage, landed quietly and settled." "Go get your paperwork," she said. He left at first light the next morning. She stood in the yard and watched him ride out. Him and Roy Callum together, saddlebags full, moving north toward the Harlan County road. And then she went back to the kitchen and put the coffee on and started breakfast. And the day began the way all the others had, except that it was different, running the ranch in his absence, and she understood that quickly. It wasn't the kitchen that was different. That was hers completely now, and had been for weeks. It was the rest of it. The men came to her with small things: a fence repair question, a supply timing issue, a decision about the water rotation for the eastern troughs. And she answered them, and they took the answers and went back to work without argument, because she'd spent 2 months earning that, and because the ranch's opinion of Clara Whitmore had quietly reversed itself over time without anyone making a ceremony of it. Jessie handled the daily ranch operations the way he always did, with the competent loyalty of a man who'd grown up on this land and knew it better than almost anyone. She and Jessie developed a rhythm over those 4 days. Morning check-in over coffee, midday update, evening accounting of what had gotten done and what was waiting. It wasn't smooth. There were things she made decisions on that she wasn't sure about and had to commit to anyway because that was what a decision meant. There was a moment on the second day when one of the newer hands, a young man named Cole, who joined the operation 6 weeks ago, pushed back on something she'd told him about the water schedule, and she'd had to stand in the middle of the yard in the September heat and be firm about it in a way that didn't leave room for negotiation. "Cole," she said, keeping her voice level, "the rotation stands. If you want to argue it with Mr. Granger when he's back, that's your right. Right now, you're arguing with me, and I'm telling you the rotation stands." Cole looked at her for a moment with that particular young man expression that was 1 part skepticism and 2 parts deciding how committed he was to his position. He went back to work. Jessie appeared at her elbow 20 minutes later. "Handled that well," he said. "Don't sound so surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. and she believed him. Ethan came on the third day. She saw the horse first, a gray she recognized as the livery's own, and then him, riding up the main approach to the ranch house in the late afternoon with the particular posture of a man who'd decided something and was arriving to deliver it. He was alone, which surprised her, though she thought about it later and understood it. He'd expected to find the ranch without Silas, which he apparently knew about somehow, and he'd calculated that alone was better for what he'd come to do. She was in the yard when he rode in. He pulled up and looked down at her from the saddle and did a slow survey of the yard. The repaired stable, the working crew, the normal functional evidence of a ranch that had absorbed a fire and a legal challenge and kept moving. And then he looked at her with something that wasn't quite the easy grin anymore. It had worn thinner. She could see through it to what was underneath. "Granger's not here," he said. "No," she said. He swung down from the saddle and walked toward her, leading the gray by the reins, and stopped about 10 feet away. "I heard he went to Harlan County." "Did you?" "Clara." He said her name the way he used to, with that particular proprietary weight that had once made her feel chosen and now made her feel nothing much at all. "You know this doesn't have to be ugly. The land claim. It's a legal matter. It's nothing personal against you. It's against the ranch," she said, "which is personal against the people who live and work on it." He looked at her steadily. "You don't belong here. You know that. You're a boarding house cook and you got lucky landing in a warm kitchen. But this," he gestured at the ranch around them, "this isn't yours." "I didn't say it was mine." "Then why are you standing in the yard like you own the place?" She looked at him. The afternoon light was going orange across the hills and the air smelled like September grass and the burned wood smell that still lingered faintly from the stable, and she felt very clear. "Because someone needs to stand in this yard," she said, "and right now that's me." His jaw tightened. Granger's not going to find what he's looking for in Harlan County. That land claim is solid. Then it'll hold up in front of the county recorder when he files his counterclaim. She kept her voice even. "And if it doesn't hold up, that'll be for the law to sort out. Either way, Ethan, you've burned a stable and paid a man to do it, and the only thing it changed is which walls those horses sleep behind." His face went still. She held his look. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know exactly what I'm talking about." She took a step toward him, not threatening, just closing the distance so there was nothing comfortable about the conversation. "Decker's gone. You know where Decker went because you paid him to go. And when the county recorder looks at the filing dates and the documentation that Silas is going to come back with from Harlan County, there's going to be a clear picture of what you've been doing and why." A long silence. "You should leave," she said. He didn't move for a moment. There was something happening behind his eyes. She could see it, the calculation shifting, the easy performance he'd always run on finally hitting something it couldn't work around. Then Jesse appeared in the stable doorway, just appeared, quietly, and stood there with his arms folded. And one of the other hands came around the corner of the bunkhouse and stopped, and the yard had 3 people in it besides Ethan and the gray horse, and the arithmetic of the situation changed visibly on his face. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung back up. "You're going to regret making an enemy of me," he said. "Ethan," she looked up at him. "I was your enemy from the morning you dropped that ring. I just didn't know it yet. You did." He turned the gray around and rode out. She watched until the horse and rider crested the approach and dropped out of sight. Jesse came to stand beside her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "You sure?" She thought about it honestly. Her heart was going faster than normal. That was the adrenaline, and she didn't pretend otherwise. And her hands had that tight, ready feeling that came after confrontation. But underneath it, she was clear. The same clear she'd been standing in the yard watching him ride in. "I'm sure," she said. Silas came back on the 4th evening with a saddlebag full of certified copies and an expression that had lost some of the weight it had been carrying. Roy Callum rode in beside him looking tired but satisfied in the manner of a man who'd gotten what he went for, and they sat at the kitchen table while Clara put supper on, because it was supper time and the men were hungry, regardless of what else had happened. And Silas spread the papers across the end of the table and walked her through them while she moved between the stove and the work table. The original land grant predated the claim by 11 years. The easement documentation was intact and certified and clear. Roy believed the counterclaim would resolve in Granger Ridge's favor within 60 days. Good, Claire said, without turning from the stove. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, Jesse told me about Cross coming here. He left without trouble. Jesse said you handled it. She turned around. He was looking at her across the kitchen with that expression she now had a full catalog for, the one that was too careful to be called open, but was as close to open as he got. He wanted me to feel like I didn't belong here, she said. He's been wanting that since before he dropped that ring. Does it work? Silas asked. She thought about the yard in the afternoon light, and Jesse appearing in the stable doorway, and the clear feeling she'd stood in while Ethan tried to take something from her that was no longer available to be taken. Not anymore, she said. She turned back to the stove. Behind her, she heard him gather up the papers and fold them carefully, and then she heard him say, quietly, to no one in particular, or possibly to her. She wasn't entirely sure. Good. The kitchen was warm and smelled like supper, and the work of it moved through her hands with the ease of 2 months of practice. And outside the window, the last of the day's light was going down behind the hills, and Granger Ridge was still standing, and so was she. The county recorder's decision came 43 days after Silas filed the counterclaim. Roy Callum rode out from Caldwell with the paperwork on a Tuesday morning, and Claire was in the kitchen when she heard the horse come in and heard Jesse whoop from somewhere near the stable. A short, sharp sound of relief rather than celebration, because that was how working people received good news, quickly and without ceremony, because there was still work to do. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the doorway. Silas was standing in the yard reading the document Roy had handed him, and she watched him read it the way she'd watched him absorb most important things, quietly, with the particular stillness of a man who'd learned not to let his face get ahead of his certainty. Then he looked up and his eyes found hers across the yard, and he gave one short nod. The eastern grazing land was Granger Ridge's, had always been. The claim filed from Harlan County had been rejected on the basis of prior documentation. 11 years of prior documentation, certified and clear, that predated anything Ethan's lawyer had tried to construct. It was over. Claire went back inside and finished what she'd been making. She thought about that, about how the ending of something you'd been braced against for months didn't arrive with any particular fanfare. No thunder, no sense of the earth shifting under your feet. Just Roy Callum on horseback and a piece of paper, and Jesse making one surprised, relieved sound in the yard, and then everyone going back to what they'd been doing because the ranch needed it. She'd been expecting to feel more. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction, or some clean sense of conclusion. Instead, she felt something quieter and more complicated. The way you feel when a thing that's been pressing on you for a long time is finally lifted, and the absence of the pressure is what you notice most. She put a pot on. There was still supper to make. 2 weeks after the ruling, on a Saturday evening when the work week had closed down and the crew was in the bunkhouse with their cards and their low conversation, Silas came to the kitchen. Not for coffee. Not with a practical question. He came in and stood at the work table and didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual enough that she stopped what she was doing and waited. He was wearing the cleaner of his 2 everyday shirts, which she'd also noticed. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a while," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at the table. I don't do this well, saying things." He looked up. "You know that. I know that. So I'm going to say it plainly, because that's the only way I know how." She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. I mean, the work is yours for as long as you want it. That's not changing, but I mean—" He stopped, tried again. "I'd like you to stay as more than the cook. I'd like you to stay as my wife, if that's something you'd consider." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him, at the weathered, honest face and the careful eyes and the burn scar on the back of his left hand that was still pink at the edges. And she thought about the morning in Tom Ellison's general store when he'd stepped into her path and offered her work with no strings on it. She thought about the kitchen doorway and the fire and the yard in the afternoon light and the work table in the mornings, and the particular quality of a silence she'd had to learn to trust before she could rest in it. She thought about the woman who'd stood in the middle of Caldwell's main street in her best dress and watched a ring drop in the dirt, and she thought about how that woman and this one were the same person, technically, but how much had been rebuilt in the 8 months between those two moments. "You're not doing it badly," she said. "What?" "Saying it. You're not doing it badly." He watched her. "Yes," she said. "I'll consider it. I've been considering it for a while, if I'm being honest." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to relief, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying longer than he'd admitted to himself. "That's—" He stopped. "Good," he said. "That's all you've got?" she said. "I told you I don't do this well." "You did tell me that." She turned back to the stove. "Ask me again tomorrow when you've thought about what to say next." "Clara, I'm not going anywhere, Silas." She said it with her back to him, even, clear, the plainest truth she had. "Ask me properly tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard what might have been. She wasn't sure, she'd never heard it before. A short, low sound that was something like a laugh, brief, genuine. "All right," he said, and left the kitchen. She stood at the stove with her hands on the pot handle and a feeling in her chest that she had no clean word for. Something warm and cautious and real, the kind of feeling that didn't announce itself grandly because it had been building quietly for months and had simply, at some point in the last 5 minutes, arrived. She wasn't 24 years old and naive about what love was supposed to look like. She knew it didn't look the same for everyone, knew it didn't have to arrive in speeches or grand gestures, knew that for some people it looked exactly like a man sitting at the end of your work table at 4:30 in the morning without needing to fill the silence. She'd had enough time at Granger Ridge to understand what was being offered. Not a rescue, not a transaction, not the particular performance that Ethan had put on in the middle of a street for an audience. Something quieter and more durable than any of that. Something she actually believed. He asked her again the next morning. He'd clearly thought about what to say, because it was longer and more specific, and included the admission that the ranch felt different with her in it, and that he wasn't talking about the food. She said yes. They married in October, 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony at the ranch with Jesse and Roy Callum and a few of the crew as witnesses, and Nell Patterson, who'd driven out from Caldwell with a pie, an expression that suggested she was extremely satisfied with how things had turned out. Clara wore the blue dress, the one with the small white buttons, the one she'd put on the morning Ethan Cross had dropped a ring in the dirt. She'd mended the hem a 4th time and let the waist out slightly and pressed it until it was as close to perfect as it was going to get. And she'd put it on that morning in front of the small mirror in what was now their quarters, no longer the narrow room behind the kitchen, and thought about the last time she'd worn it. She didn't feel angry, standing there. She'd expected to feel something pointed about the symmetry of it, using the same dress, reclaiming the day. But what she felt was mostly tired of the whole thing. Tired of Ethan Cross occupying any real estate in her mind at all. He was a man who'd needed her to be small to feel large, and she'd spent 8 months becoming someone who didn't fit that requirement anymore, and she was ready to be done allocating thought to him. She picked up her mother's thimble from the nightstand and put it in her pocket. The ceremony was brief, practical. The man who performed it was the same county official who'd notarized the land paperwork, which seemed fitting. Silas said what he meant to say in the same plain way he said everything, and when he looked at her, it was with the same steadiness she'd been building a life beside for 8 months, and she said what she meant to say back. Jesse cried. He tried to hide it and failed, and Nell Patterson handed him a handkerchief without comment, and after the ceremony was done, he told Clara quietly that he'd never been so glad to have someone show up and change something. "I didn't change anything," she said. "You changed how the kitchen smelled," he said, "which changed how supper felt, which changed how the whole crew treated the end of the day." He folded the handkerchief into a small square. "Things change in small ways first." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The news about Ethan Cross came in November, through Tom Ellison, who told Jesse, who told Clara in the matter-of-fact way that Jesse delivered most information. Ethan had sold the livery, The story, as it filtered through Caldwell's channels, was that the lawyer from Harlan County had cost him more than he'd planned for, and the business hadn't recovered from it. He'd left town sometime in late October. No announcement, no ceremony, just the livery sign coming down one day and a stranger showing up the following week saying he'd bought the operation through a broker. Clara absorbed this information while she was sorting dry goods in the cold room. She didn't feel satisfied. She'd thought she might, had half expected the news to land with some sense of scales balancing, but what she felt instead was closer to nothing, the particular nothing of a thing that had stopped mattering. She finished sorting the dry goods. She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The letter from the Caldwell Banking Company came in February, 7 months into their marriage, addressed to Clara Whitmore, her old name, which meant it had been in some file somewhere, waiting for her forwarding address to catch up to her. She opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Silas was outside and the crew was working and the ranch was in the comfortable rhythm of a winter day. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a long moment. The letter was from the banking company's records department. A routine audit, they explained, had uncovered an administrative error made 12 years prior, a clerical misapplication of foreclosure proceedings against the Whitmore farm account. In plain terms, the bank had made a mistake. The property, which had been seized and resold when Clara was 12 years old, the property her father had worked, and her mother had planted a kitchen garden behind, and where Clara had learned to read sitting on the porch steps. That property had not been legally forfeitable under the terms of the original loan agreement. The bank was prepared to discuss remediation. She put the letter down. She looked at the kitchen wall. 12 years. She'd spent 12 years believing the farm was gone because her family had lost it, because poverty and bad luck had taken it the way poverty and bad luck took things from people who didn't have the means to fight back. She'd carried the weight of that as something that simply was. One of the foundational facts of her life, like the bump on her nose and her mother's fever and the particular shape of being the girl nobody expected much from. And it had been a mistake, a clerical error, a number in the wrong column. She sat in the kitchen for a long time. When Silas came in for his mid-morning coffee, she was still sitting there, and he looked at her face and sat down across the table without asking, and she handed him the letter and waited while he read it. He read it once, then read it again. He set it down. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the letter on the table. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" She was quiet for another moment. Outside, the winter light was thin and clean across the valley, and she could see the hills from the kitchen window, the eastern ridge that was theirs now, the pasture that had nearly been taken, the landscape she'd spent 8 months learning to read the way she'd learned to read a person. "There are children in this town," she said slowly, "who are growing up the way I grew up. No school worth the name within reasonable distance, no teacher who's going to stay longer than a season. And the building they use now is the back room of the feed mill, which is not—" She stopped. "It's not right. It's not enough." Silas was watching her. "The farm property is about 4 acres, she said. "The house is probably past saving, but the land is flat and the well is still good, I'd imagine. It's close enough to town that families could get there without a full day's travel." She picked up the letter. "I want to sign it over, to the county or to a school board if one can be organized. I want it to be a school." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's a significant thing," he said. "Not a challenge, just acknowledgement." "I know." "It was your parents' land." "It was." She folded the letter carefully. "And the best thing I can do with it is make sure it stands for something they'd have recognized. My father believed that if a person could read and reason, they could manage almost anything. My mother—" She stopped, the way she always stopped when her mother came up, the grief old and manageable but present. "My mother used to say that what you give away is the only thing you actually keep." Silas looked at her across the table. "All right," he said. "Just all right?" "It's the right thing to do," he said. "You know it is. You don't need me to tell you that." He picked up his coffee. "What you need is someone to ride into town with you when you go to talk to the banking company, and probably someone to help organize the county board, because Roy Callum knows everyone, and Roy owes me a favor." She looked at him. "2 is harder to mess with than 1, he said. She recognized her own words coming back at her and felt something shift in her face that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. "I know Roy's wife makes terrible coffee," she said, "but I suppose we can endure it." The school took 18 months to build. It wasn't a straight line. Nothing real ever was. There were county board meetings that went badly and had to be redone. A contractor who took 2 months of advance payment and disappeared. A winter that delayed the foundation work. A disagreement about the curriculum that Clara had to navigate, with a school board that had 3 different opinions about what children in a frontier town actually needed to learn. She navigated it the way she'd navigated everything else in the past 2 years. Through work, through stubbornness, through the willingness to sit in a room full of people who didn't necessarily take her seriously and make her case until the room changed its mind. Jesse helped. Nell Patterson helped. Roy Callum's connections helped. Silas showed up to every county board meeting without being asked and sat in the back and said nothing unless directly addressed, which turned out to be its own kind of presence, the kind that communicated, without words, that the Granger name was behind this and the Granger name carried weight in this county. Clara noticed this and felt something about it that she took a while to identify. Not discomfort exactly, more like a recalibration, learning what it meant to have someone stand behind you without standing in front of you. She'd spent so long operating entirely alone that the experience of support without interference was something she had to actively learn to receive. She was still learning it. The school opened in the spring of the second year, a proper building on the Whitmore land, 4 acres of flat, well-watered ground on the edge of Caldwell, with a real structure that had 4 windows and a wood stove and enough room for 30 children and a teacher who'd been recruited from back east by a letter Clara had written herself. There was a small ceremony. Clara stood at the back of it, which was where she preferred to stand, and watched the children file into the building in their various states of reluctance and curiosity. And she listened to the county commissioner say words about community investment and the future of the territory. And she thought about her father on the porch steps and her mother's kitchen garden and the 12 years she'd spent believing that what was taken couldn't be reclaimed. It could be reclaimed. Not always in the form you lost it, not always in the way you expected, but the substance of it, the thing underneath the thing, the values and the intention and the belief that work and fairness and decency were worth something, that could come back transformed into something bigger than what it had been. Silas found her at the back of the crowd and stood beside her without saying anything. After a moment, she put her hand in his. He laced his fingers through hers and they stood there while the commissioner finished his speech, and the children disappeared into the building and the crowd began to disperse, and the spring light came down warm and ordinary across the valley. Years later, not many years but enough, the school would be called the Whitmore School by everyone in Caldwell, even though no official name had ever been given to it. It just became what people called it, the way things become their names through use rather than declaration. Clara never quite got used to hearing it. Every time someone said it in her presence, she felt that same small jolt, a surprise that her name was attached to something that children walked into every morning. She mentioned this to Silas once, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, the kind of evening that belonged to the tail end of summer when the light stayed long and the air was finally cooling and the ranch settled into the particular piece of a working day properly ended. "Doesn't feel right," she said, "hearing my name on it." "Why not?" She thought about it. "Because I didn't do it to have my name on something." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening hills. "No," he said. "But the name's not for you. It's for the kids who'll go there for the next 50 years. So they know someone did it. So they know the kind of person that does something like that actually exists." She sat with that. She thought about 12-year-old Clara Whitmore, with her dead father's farm, and her fever-sick mother, and her mended dress, navigating a town that had already decided what she was and wasn't going to be. She thought about what it might have meant to that girl. Not a story about a perfect person who had everything and gave some of it away, but a story about a woman who'd had almost nothing, who'd stood in the middle of a street with a ring in the dirt at her feet and kept walking. She thought it might have meant something to 12-year-old Clara to know that was a thing a person could do. "I suppose," she said. The hills went dark. The last of the light held at the top of the eastern ridge for a moment. the ridge that was theirs now and would remain so before it went too. Silas refilled her coffee without being asked and handed it back. She held it in both hands, her rough, work-worn hands, the hands that had made 8 months of meals in a kitchen that had become hers, and then made a life in a place she'd arrived at with nothing. And she drank it, and the evening came in around them, and the ranch was quiet. The woman who had once been told, in front of an entire town, that she wasn't worth choosing, that woman was still here. That was the whole of it. The whole lesson, if it could be called that. You keep walking, not because the road becomes easier, and not because the people who laughed at you eventually apologize, and not because some larger force straightens out what was crooked. You keep walking because you are still there, still standing, still yourself. And that, in the end, is the only thing no one can drop in the dirt and leave behind. The school took 18 months to build. It wasn't a straight line. Nothing real ever was. There were county board meetings that went badly and had to be redone. A contractor who took 2 months of advance payment and disappeared. A winter that delayed the foundation work. A disagreement about the curriculum that Clara had to navigate with a school board that had 3 different opinions about what children in a frontier town actually needed to learn. She navigated it the way she'd navigated everything else in the past 2 years. Through work, through stubbornness, through the willingness to sit in a room full of people who didn't necessarily take her seriously and make her case until the room changed its mind. Jesse helped. Nell Patterson helped. Roy Callum's connections helped. Silas showed up to every county board meeting without being asked and sat in the back and said nothing unless directly addressed, which turned out to be its own kind of presence, the kind that communicated without words that the Granger name was behind this, and the Granger name carried weight in this county. Clara noticed this and felt something about it that she took a while to identify. Not discomfort exactly, more like a recalibration, learning what it meant to have someone stand behind you without standing in front of you. She'd spent so long operating entirely alone that the experience of support without interference was something she had to actively learn to receive. She was still learning it. The school opened in the spring of the second year. A proper building on the Whitmore land, 4 acres of flat, well-watered ground on the edge of Caldwell, with a real structure that had 4 windows and a wood stove and enough room for 30 children and a teacher who'd been recruited from back east by a letter Clara had written herself. There was a small ceremony. Clara stood at the back of it, which was where she preferred to stand, and watched the children file into the building in their various states of reluctance and curiosity. And she listened to the county commissioner say words about community investment and the future of the territory, and she thought about her father on the porch steps and her mother's kitchen garden and the 12 years she'd spent believing that what was taken couldn't be reclaimed. It could be reclaimed. Not always in the form you lost it, not always in the way you expected, but the substance of it, the thing underneath the thing, the values and the intention and the belief that work and fairness and decency were worth something. That could come back transformed into something bigger than what it had been. Silas found her at the back of the crowd and stood beside her without saying anything. After a moment, she put her hand in his. He laced his fingers through hers, and they stood there while the commissioner finished his speech, and the children disappeared into the building, and the crowd began to disperse, and the spring light came down warm and ordinary across the valley. Years later, not many years, but enough, the school would be called the Whitmore School by everyone in Caldwell, even though no official name had ever been given to it. It just became what people called it, the way things become their names through use rather than declaration. Clara never quite got used to hearing it. Every time someone said it in her presence, she felt that same small jolt, a surprise that her name was attached to something that children walked into every morning. She mentioned this to Silas once, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper. The kind of evening that belonged to the tail end of summer when the light stayed long and the air was finally cooling and the ranch settled into the particular piece of a working day properly ended. "Doesn't feel right," she said. "Hearing my name on it. Why not?" She thought about it. "Because I didn't do it to have my name on something." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening hills. "No," he said, "but the name's not for you. It's for the kids who'll go there for the next 50 years. So they know someone did it. So they know the kind of person that does something like that actually exists." She sat with that. She thought about 12-year-old Clara Whitmore, with her dead father's farm and her fever-sick mother and her mended dress, navigating a town that had already decided what she was and wasn't going to be. She thought about what it might have meant to that girl. Not a story about a perfect person who had everything and gave some of it away, but a story about a woman who'd had almost nothing, who'd stood in the middle of a street with a ring in the dirt at her feet and kept walking. She thought it might have meant something to 12-year-old Clara to know that was a thing a person could do. "I suppose," she said. The hills went dark. The last of the light held at the top of the eastern ridge for a moment. The ridge that was theirs now and would remain so before it went too. Silas refilled her coffee without being asked and handed it back. She held it in both hands, her rough, work-worn hands, the hands that had made 8 months of meals in a kitchen that had become hers and then made a life in a place she'd arrived at with nothing. And she drank it, and the evening came in around them, and the ranch was quiet. The woman who had once been told, in front of an entire town, that she wasn't worth choosing, that woman was still here. That was the whole of it, the whole lesson, if it could be called that. You keep walking, not because the road becomes easier, and not because the people who laughed at you eventually apologize, and not because some larger force straightens out what was crooked. You keep walking because you are still there, still standing, still yourself. And that, in the end, is the only thing no one can drop in the dirt and leave behind.